things over to my panelists to introduce themselves, I want to provide a couple tips on housekeeping items so that way you are prepared for the session tonight and have some additional information. The first thing that I want to share is that we are recording this session, so you can log back into this platform at any time to access this recording on demand. So all you need to do is use that same link that you were provided via email to log in and access this session at any time if you want to revisit some of the topics that we covered this evening. We will also be taking questions via Q&A, so feel free to enter your questions in the chat this evening, and I will ask those questions of our panelists. So feel free to enter those questions now, and we'll answer those towards the end of our program this evening. We also want to know a little bit more about you tonight. So I have just sent a survey to the audience. If you will respond to those 3 questions, that will help our panelists know a little bit more about our audience and where you're joining us from and really where you're at in the college search process as well. But again, thank you for joining us tonight. We have a lot of great information prepared for you to help you successfully navigate the college search process. So without further ado, I am going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves at this time.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kelsey Mark, and I serve as the Senior Admissions Counselor at the University of Washington. I'm really excited to be here with you today to offer more of the University of Washington perspective as we think about the college search. I mainly serve students in Northwest Washington. I also work with students in San Diego, and then I also am the point of contact for a number of states in the Midwest, as well as the Northeast of the U.S. So again, super excited to be here with you today, and I'll hand it over to Derek to introduce himself.
Thanks, Kelsey. Hi, everyone. My name is Derek Rogers. I serve as the Director of College Counseling at Rainier Scholars, which is a college access organization here in Seattle. I'm wrapping up my 12th year in the profession. I previously worked in college admission at a small private school down in Southern California. I actually recruited in Washington, so I've been working with Washington students throughout these last 12 years and work primarily with juniors and seniors. And really excited to be here and to talk with you today about some key ways to start your process. Thanks for joining us. I'll turn it over to Kelly Herrington.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Kelly Herrington, the Director of College Counseling and Student Services at University Prep. I joke that I work in the shipping department here at University Prep. I've been in the profession for about 25 years, and I have the receding hair to prove it. I absolutely love working with students and families and demystifying the college process. So it's an honor. Thank you, the University of Washington, for letting me be here. And I'm going to pass it off. I feel like we're in a relay race in honor of the Olympics, and the baton now is going to be passed off to Mary Beth.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Beth Haselfeld, and I am a college and career specialist at Skyline High School, which is over in Sammamish. I've been here at Skyline for about 4 years, and prior to joining the team here, I worked in higher education, primarily in study abroad at schools such as Seattle University and Claremont McKenna. And all of my experiences working in higher ed, as well as my own personal education pathway, has just inspired me to get into the field. And so I'm thrilled to be here with UW tonight because picking the right school is my favorite conversation to have with students. So with that, I think that's the whole team. So I am going to go ahead and kick it off. Hopefully I do this right. And we are going to talk about choosing the right school for you. So I'm just going to preface this all by saying we recognize, all of us here on the panel recognize that this is a very daunting topic, and we only have an hour. We're just going to cover kind of some tips and tricks and ways to sort of tackle this big subject. And so what we've done is we've kind of broken it into 3 phases, because I personally think it's always easy to tackle something that feels overwhelming if you can break it down, right? And so we broke it down into 3 phases that I'm going to cover. And then after I go through those 3, we're going to kick it off to different team members to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive on some of those topics. The first thing that we always recommend you do is to start with reflection. I think it's so tempting to just dive straight into research, right? Like there are all these schools out there, and I'm just going to start by figuring out what's where and what can I study here and where do I want to be. But I think it's actually more important to kind of take that step back and ask yourself some personal questions, because that's going to be the easiest way to sort of maneuver this seemingly overwhelming process, right? So let's start with reflection. There are kind of 5 big questions to ask yourself when you're going through this reflection process. The first one, I think, seems like the most obvious, right? Like, where do I want to live? It seems like a very simple question. But I actually think that there's a little bit more to that than just where do I want to live. You can look at it on the simple side. Like, I knew I wanted to go to the East Coast, and so I only looked on the East Coast. You could say I hate snow and I don't want to be somewhere where it's going to snow 6 months out of the year. So there definitely are some kind of surface level questions as it relates to where do I want to be. But there are also deeper questions, like what kind of community do I want to be engaged in? Do I want to be at a mission-driven institution? Is it important to me to be in an urban setting? Do I want to have access to, the theater and things like that are super simple to find based on my location? So when you're thinking about where, don't just stop at the weather, right? Like, ask yourself some more questions about where you want to be, because this in theory is going to be your home. And so it's important that it is a place that you feel like you can be at home when you're there. The next one is actually a question I think a lot of students overlook, which is like, what size of a school do I want to be at? How many students do I want to be in my community? And I think that that's really so important, because the size of your school really trickles down into a lot of the different facets of your educational experience. If you're at a huge school, obviously you're going to have a lot of kids in your classes. The student-teacher ratio is going to be changed. But then at big schools, you're also going to maybe have more access to different resources or different experiences, just a wider variety of clubs and activities that you can engage in. And so the size of that school really can have a great impact on the type of experience you have and kind of that community feel. And so certainly take the time to think about where you see yourself thriving. Is it at a bigger school, smaller school, or somewhere kind of in between? That next question, I think, is the one that most people get stuck on, which is what do I want to do? And I know in my experience, and I'm guessing most of the panelists here would agree, that a lot of times it's easy to pigeonhole your search process into what do I want to major in? And maybe even more so, what do I want to be? Like, what's my ultimate career goal? And I think oftentimes that can kind of cast a shadow on the rest of the process, in the sense that it kind of guides everything else that you're looking at. And while it's certainly important to think about that, I do think that there are other pieces to the what can I do at this school puzzle. So what can you major in? And I usually tell students that I don't expect you to know exactly what you want to do at this point. I still don't think I know exactly what I want to do with my life, so I certainly wouldn't expect you to. And so usually thinking about, like, what are 3 things I'm passionate about, right? Like, what are 3 majors or careers I see myself pursuing, and find a school that has all 3. That way, if you get there and you take that first computer science class and you hate it, there's still some other options of things that you might be excited about. So what can I study? But also, what else can I do, right? Like, can I do internships? Can I study abroad? Can I participate in super cool, obscure intramural sports, right? Look at what that community offers to you, both academically and socially, because that's going to create your holistic experience while you are at your school. How much is it going to cost? I think this is obviously a huge question, and definitely a conversation to have with your family as well. I'm not going to talk about it too much, because we're going to talk about it way more in depth here in a minute. But obviously that should be a big piece of the reflection process of how much do I have to spend on this experience. And then my personal favorite question is why? Why do I want to be at this school? I think, and I'm sure my friends here tonight would agree, that it's very easy in this day and age to get caught up in rankings and where are my friends going, or maybe where did my parents go, and to feel like that is kind of the defining piece of your search process. But this is just kind of a friendly reminder that this is your college experience. And so when you're doing this reflection process, think about, why do I want to be at this school? Not why does someone else want me to go there, or why does US News tell me I should go there? Why do I want to be there, right? So take the time to kind of keep yourself in check as you go through this, to make sure that you're guiding yourself on this process for what you want, not someone else. So after you do this reflection and you feel like you kind of have an idea of what you want to do, then it's time to start to research, right? Come up with your list. This is the exciting part, I think. And there are lots of ways to do that. We're going to talk in a minute about some of the best resources out there for producing that list. But those resources too, just know that they will also guide you through all of the questions that I just touched on, right? So you can check little boxes that say, I want a big school, I want an urban school. And so there are great databases and search engines that we'll cover in a minute. In addition to that, be sure to tap into the resources at your school. You have college and career specialists, you have your school counselor, people who are experts in the field who know the different schools that are out there and can also engage with you in meaningful conversation about what you're looking for in an institution and maybe what schools might be a good fit for you. So be sure to reach out to the folks at your school, mentors, coaches, anyone that knows you to kind of engage in those conversations about what schools might be a good fit. You're also, of course, going to want to reach out to the different admissions offices of schools you might be interested in. That includes obviously direct connection with them, and they're fabulous and they want to connect with you. Admissions officers love talking to students, so be sure to do that. But also maybe check your school to see what kind of presentations they're providing on campus. And you can also participate in college fairs. So there are lots of ways to kind of get a good feel for what schools are out there, in a bigger setting like a college fair, but also a more intimate one, such as at your individual high school. Once you kind of go through that process and maybe do one of these search engines and talk to some people, hopefully you will come up with a first draft list. And the one thing I kind of want to, I guess the one point I want to drive home here is that list is living and breathing, right? It's not like the schools you come up with on day one are the only schools you can look into. I would encourage you to keep an open mind, because maybe when you go to one of those college fairs or pop into an admissions presentation, a school that wasn't on that list might kind of grab your attention, and that's worth looking into and pursuing. So just remind yourself periodically that you can always add and take away schools from that list as you should. So once you start that researching process, then you have that first draft list. Then the third kind of phase of this is the review. The number one tip here is to get and stay organized. I always tell my students that you're going to want to come up with a pretty thorough Excel spreadsheet as quickly as possible with columns of things that are important to you. So if it is important to you to have study abroad, if it is important to you that there are cultural programming available on your campus, those are columns that should go on your spreadsheet, because again, this is your college search, right? That Excel spreadsheet should include deadlines and also just things that are going to kind of keep you on task so that you know what you need to do as you're going through the process. Once you're in that review phase, this is where you're going to want to start to kind of look for more nuanced traits about those institutions. So maybe your whole list they all have biology, but you know specifically that you want to go to a school where you can do research as an undergrad in the field, where they have pre-med advising programs. And so you can start to kind of look for some of those more specific pieces once you get into this review process, which will naturally start to kind of filter your list for you. And then this is where you're going to want to get some more personalized opinions, whether that's through visits, which we're going to talk about in a minute, how to make the most of those visits, but also maybe connecting with alums or current students of that school too. And that will help you sort of take that list from maybe a bigger one into your ultimately the smaller list of schools that are a good fit for you. And that means a good fit for schools that you want to pursue, also schools that you think you can get into, and having a good variety of institutions represented. And so I think with that, I'm going to hand the baton back. We're back to the relay. I think it's going back over to Kelly, and he's going to start to talk us through some of the more specifics involved here.
Fabulous. Thank you, Mary Beth. I've grabbed the baton, which is a number 2 pencil, which is a great segue into my first topic, and that is standardized testing. And often when you work as a college counselor, standardized testing is the first thing that families and students ask you about. And one of the silver linings from COVID is that many colleges have gone test optional, or particularly here on the West Coast, test blind, meaning that even if you had a score and you wanted to submit it, they will not look at it as part of the review process. And so it is so gratifying as a college counselor now to be able to really tell students you are not going to be defined by your test scores. And one piece of advice around testing is that it is one part of the process at some schools, but the vast majority of schools are test optional. They will be test optional for the foreseeable future. And please remember, for those of you who take the SAT or the ACT, your life is not measured by those scores. A test score can never measure your heart, your character, your ability to generate your own ideas, to give back to others. No score will ever determine those really important pieces of who you are. And when you're 30, nobody cares how you did on the SAT or the ACT. So it's really important to keep it in perspective, and it is important to remember that the vast majority of colleges, particularly the public universities on the West Coast, will not look at test scores even if you have them. Mary Beth did a great job about talking about using your resources, in particular your counselor, your high school counselor. If you are applying to some schools that are test optional, a good person to talk to is your counselor about the importance of whether submitting test scores to that school will help you or hinder you. You can also reach directly out to a college admissions office as well about whether you should submit your test scores or not. So a good resource is always to go directly to the source, your counselor or to the college. We often get asked about the difference between these tests and how the SAT and the ACT kind of vary. And what I like to say is that the SAT and the ACT are kind of like fraternal twins. They share a lot of the same genetic kind of makeup, but there are slight differences between those tests. They used to be significantly different, but now, because of the changes that were made to these tests, they are very similar. The biggest difference is the ACT has a science section. So colleges really look at the SAT or an ACT equally. Do not think that they prefer one test to the other. There are a lot of wonderful free resources out there to help you prepare. And we are a big fan on the high school side of Khan Academy. We also want to let you know that there is a myth out there that the more studying you do, the more you're going to increase your scores. And really what the research shows is that 10 hours of practice, after you've done 10 sincere hours of practice, you've probably reached your limit of how far you are going to be able to improve your scores. And then the best way to prepare for these tests is really by reading and reading some more. And as the son of an English teacher and a librarian, it always makes me happy to be able to say the best way to prepare for these tests is to read. But really, it is going to be okay with these standardized tests. And if you are not a test taker and a strong test taker, you don't feel it's a good indicator of who you are, you do not have to take these tests and submit them. Connecting with colleges. So there are many ways that you can connect with colleges, and colleges over the past year have really upped their game with regard to their virtual offerings. And I mean, look at all that the UW is doing this summer. They have something pretty much every single Wednesday. And colleges don't have a preference whether you are doing an in-person or virtual visit. They just want you to connect. And there are some colleges out there that track demonstrated interest. The University of Washington is not one of those schools. And what that means is that when you apply, the college is looking to see if you've interacted with them. And most colleges will publish this on their websites. One of the good advantages of connecting with colleges, regardless of whether they track demonstrated interest or not, is that colleges will ask many supplemental essay questions about why you are applying. And when you connect with a college, you learn a little bit more about that college, and therefore, when you're asked why you're applying, you have more information that you can reference. Many colleges are starting to open up in person, and if you go to their website, they will direct you to their virtual and in-person offerings. We are seeing that it is more prevalent in the Northeast right now for in-person visits, but it is spreading across the country. When you visit a campus or you're engaged in a virtual event, we encourage you to focus on the 3 Ps. the programming that the schools offer academically, extracurricularly, the sense of place, as well as the people. So keep that 3 Ps rule in mind. We would also encourage you not to judge a school based on one touch point. And there may be a few of you out there that will visit a college or log on and to a webinar and not like the person who's presenting. Or you'll drive to a campus and you'll not like the tour guide. Or you'll read something online. Please use many sources before you make an assessment of a school. And if you drive all the way to a college and you get there and you don't like how the campus looks and you don't want to get out of the car to go on that tour. If your parents have made the effort, you've made the effort to go there, go on that tour. Okay, but use many resources and don't judge a school based on one touch point. Take notes. And Mary Beth did a great job telling you to create a Google Doc or an Excel document. But please take notes because, again, the colleges will be asking you often why you are applying. And it helps you when you're starting to make your final decision to reference some of the information that you've learned earlier on. And we would encourage you to prepare questions. Often when you're on tours, it's a time for you to really interact, or even in the virtual programming, directly with admissions representatives. Please do not be nervous about talking to admissions representatives. As you could tell when Kelsey introduced herself, and hopefully you'll get to talk to Aubrey a little bit as well from the University of Washington, admissions counselors are paid to be friendly. They are happy people. They are people, they're people, right? They want to connect with you. And so please use them as a resource. We would also encourage you after each visit, when you're taking your notes, to be comprehensive in how you are documenting what you've seen. And here's an example of a college visit checklist. So it talks about some of those self-reflection questions that Mary Beth referenced, the place, the size, and then ask a student some questions, and then jot down your impressions. And some of the best people to ask when you're visiting a school are not the tour guides, although they're very informative, but the people in the cafeteria, the people that you see walking across campus. So talk to some random people when you're touring a school, but do make sure that you take those notes afterwards. So just to recap, the programs, the place, the people. And as you think about standardized testing, remember that you're more than a test score. So I'm going to now pass the baton, our number 2 pencil, off here to Derek.
Thanks, Kelly. And I'd like to talk a little bit about financial aid. And, for many students and families, this topic is kind of top of mind when discussing college planning. And I'd say over my experience in the profession, that's only become increasingly true. And honestly, financial aid could be an entire presentation in and of itself today. But to try to give you a good starting point for tackling the process, we're going to take a look at some of the key elements and then also provide some takeaways for you to continue on with as you navigate the process. So first, let's take a look at a few of the key terms you'll likely encounter in the process. The first is net price, and that's the amount that a student pays to attend an institution in a single academic year, but after subtracting scholarships and grants that a student receives. So this is really the price you should focus on. And, the sticker price is what often comes up, right? You hear about $80,000 for cost of attendance. The media likes to focus on this price, right? It's bigger, it's more sensational, it's more than it used to be. So parents think back to when they were in school and can't fathom the difference. But it's important to know that few students and families actually pay that sticker price. So there's a lot of discounting that can happen through different financial aid mechanisms. And that many colleges have actually given more money in aid over the years from even when I applied. So a question that comes up when you think about, well, okay, this net price sounds great. How do I get that number? And initially at this stage, that's where the net price calculator comes in. And that's a tool that can help prospective students and families get a better sense of what the estimated cost would be. Obviously, since you haven't gone through the application process yet, it'll just be an estimate. But it gets you in the ballpark of what is expected at a particular college. And this is something that's a tool that's required by law to be on a college's website. So you'll find it on any college's website. And students really just need, and parents can enter their information about their family's financial situation to learn what similar students paid at the institution previously. So it gives some good perspective there based on data at the school. And it honestly, thinking about all of the great content Mary Beth went over and Kelly went over already, this is another piece that's often underused by students and families when they're researching colleges. Really, this tool can help you create a more balanced list, really giving you more options to consider. For example, you might find a college that looks like it costs an astronomical amount, but actually meets 100% of your needs. So they'll actually come through with the strongest financial aid package you'll see. So it's important to really delineate those things out and really get a sense of what the cost will be for you specifically. So that's one example of where that net price calculator can be really effective. And the University of Washington's net price calculator is pretty accurate, so it can be a good starting place, I would say, and one that I use with my students. I think, again, too, that this tool can really make comparing colleges easier along that financial dimension. So you can really line up and see from the get-go, this college is going to cost X, this college is going to cost Y, and this college is going to cost Z. And that can give you some insight onto whether you want to continue pursuing that, looking into that college or not. So again, it can get you some data earlier on. Honestly, the best way to navigate and find one of the net price calculators, sometimes they aren't easy to access, is really just to type it into the college's search bar on their website. The actual form itself takes about 10 to 15 minutes. So it's totally doable to do that for multiple schools. And it can be a great activity for your parents to do if they're wondering what can they help with. This is an excellent activity just to give them a list of schools that you're considering and for them to get their tax information out and start banging out these net price calculators. So that can be a really good activity to have them do. And again, it's an estimate. So, if you're thinking of this as T-Mobile Park, right? You're at a Mariners game, it's going to show you kind of what section you're in, but it's not going to tell you your exact seat. So think of it that way. There is still some room where it could shift, but it's the best and most accurate data you'll get on how much it might cost to go to a school. The COA is the next term we'll look at, and that stands for the cost of attendance. And that's the full cost of a year of college tuition, room and board, student fees, transportation, and miscellaneous expenses. And often one of the things I know with my students that families are looking at first is the tuition only. And really you want to consider all those factors, right? And colleges aren't going to bill you for things like travel and miscellaneous expenses. Those are just there for you to budget in, knowing that students are coming from different places, right? Some students are going, if you're going to the UW, you might be coming from across town, so it's not going to cost you a plane flight. But they just put that in there to help you budget. But it's important to look at the cost beyond just the tuition. The expected family contribution or EFC is the number that's used to determine students' eligibility for aid. And this will change its name. This name will be changed in a few years. But for your process, most likely it will stay as the EFC. And that's, again, going to be how a school calculates need. And we'll go to the calculation in a second. The biggest drivers of this, like what influences an expected family contribution, those items are income and household size. So those are kind of the two key components that represent the primary drivers of what that number will be. And so if you're thinking about this as an equation, the cost of attendance minus the expected family contribution equals the amount of need-based aid that you're eligible for. So this will be that you'll see that difference. And again, they budget not just off tuition, but they're using cost of attendance. So that's a benefit. And one thing to keep in mind though, is this doesn't mean that a school will necessarily meet that full need. And that's an important consideration as you select schools. So even if you have that need, that doesn't mean every school has the resources to meet you kind of where you're at. So that's something, again, to consider as you look at schools. Looking at forms, and this is really kind of getting into some of the action items for what you'll need to do, not right at this moment, but something that you'll need to do starting this fall. The FAFSA form, so the free application for federal student aid, is kind of the ubiquitous form, the main form you'll need to be concerned with. And you can find that, it's a federal government site, so it'll be fafsa.gov. And all U.S. colleges that provide federal aid will require this form. So even if you don't think you qualify, I think it can be important to submit that form. And, again, it's money mainly looking at money from the government, but can also be used to determine institutional aid. So colleges might award grants based on that EFC number that comes from filling out the FAFSA. But primarily it's looking at, do you qualify for Pell Grants, which is a type of federal grant for low-income students, federal loans, federal work studies, working on campus, and then also some state aid as well. And we'll talk a little bit about the different types of aid in a minute, but that's one tool that's how colleges get that number. So in addition to some private schools where they'll give institutional grant money using that FAFSA number. And you're using 2020 tax data for this form. So you'll have that on hand already. And you think about it, if you're always applying for the year you are going to school. So you're not applying for, 20, 21, 22. You're going to be applying, if you're a senior, you're going to be applying for 22, 23. So that first year you're going to enter college. The FAFSA takes about 45 minutes to an hour and a half if you're doing it in one sitting. You can log back in and out, so it makes it really convenient. It's free to apply, which is great as well. So, sometimes you'll hear scam sites and see that, they're charging you to do it. Get off that site ASAP. The FAFSA.gov site, .ed.gov site will get you to the appropriate version. There's an app you can use. You can do it mobile if you prefer. I'd say it's better on a desktop or laptop, but you do have that option. The WASFA form is similar to the FAFSA, although it's run through the state of Washington, and so not the federal government. And this form is only for students who have DACA or are undocumented, and it allows those students to apply for aid in Washington state. So that's really access to the Washington College Grant. So it's very similar to FAFSA, asks for similar information, but is administered through the state and is free to apply. There's no fee. And the link is on there, the readysetgrad.org /WASFA site. So that's where you can access that. CSS Profile is the College Board, the same folks who administer the SAT. This is their financial aid application. And this is used by about 400 colleges throughout the country. In the Northwest here, I think you have Whitman College, Lewis and Clark, Reed use it. And then schools like Stanford, USC, the Ivy League schools, and many other liberal arts colleges and other mainly private institutions use this form to determine institutional aid. So it asks more questions than the FAFSA and digs in a little deeper into family assets. So it depends on what schools you apply to, whether or not you'll have to fill out the CSS profile, but I just want to make sure you're aware of it. And it is something that you'll submit to the institution, to the General College Board site, and then they'll send it to the institution itself. So you'll input their code and it'll send that off for you. It does cost money. That's one of the big differences between the FAFSA and the CSS profile. So it takes a little longer as well to do oftentimes, but has similar questions. So doing the FAFSA first can be a great way to then prep for the CSS profile if that's what you want to do. There are fee waivers available, though, to help cover that cost. So that's something you'll want to check in about with your counselor or on the CSS profile website. Institution-specific forms, not really a big concern. This isn't something that's going to be that common, but in case schools have separate scholarship applications, separate financial aid forms, just something to be aware of and check in. But again, it's not that common. So really you want to focus on FAFSA, CSS profile in your search, in your financial aid process. And just some context for like when you should do all of this stuff. October 1st is when the FAFSA and the CSS profile and the WASFA are available. So really have that in your calendars. You can get started right away. So you can knock that out really early. The winter time is more deadline time. So for the University of Washington, I think the deadline, if it's the same this year, will be the 15th of January. And for most schools in Washington State, January 31st is the last date for that. In the spring, you'll after submitting all of this and turning in any documentation you need to additionally, you'll receive all the financial aid awards and then be able to kind of compare and lay out the offers and see which one is the best financial fit. Thinking next about the types of financial aid, really we'll focus the grants and scholarships just off the bat are kind of the free money portion, right? They're money you don't have to pay back. So those are kind of the two best forms of financial aid. And with grants, that's typically need-based. So those awards are typically given by state and federal governments, but also institutions, typically private colleges. Examples of grants are the Pell Grant, which comes from filling out the FAFSA from the federal government, the Washington College Grant, which comes from the state of Washington for low and middle income families. And again, you'll need to fill out the FAFSA to obtain these grants, and at some schools, the CSS profile. But just another form of free money that, again, is typically based on your expected family contribution, but not always. Scholarships, on the other hand, are often merit-based or interest-based, but can also be need-based as well. And those are awarded by the college themselves or outside companies or private organizations if you're looking at outside scholarships. One thing to note with scholarships, and this is where I think the net price calculator can be helpful, is that most free money, so grants and scholarships, comes from colleges or the state and federal government. So it's important to keep that in mind because hope isn't really a strategy with scholarships. There's really good data out there to see kind of what a school might be able to award you. And if that's a really, really large gap and financial aid is a big concern, you'll want to really evaluate if that school should be on your list or if there's another option that might be more feasible. So I think that's important to keep in mind too, is that outside scholarships are a piece of the puzzle, but they're not as significant oftentimes as the money awarded by a school or the state and federal government. So again, looking at that, and that's where the net price calculator can give you that data up front. So something to keep in mind there. Work study is an interesting option for students, and that is working a job on campus. It's typically awarded through the FAFSA and qualifying it for federal work study, but there are some jobs on campus that are college work study jobs, so they don't depend on your need. And really, this is just working on campus for about 10 to 15 hours a week, so it's definitely manageable, and the folks on campus know that you're a student first, so they're not asking you to do 20-hour weeks, 30-hour weeks. They're not asking you to close up necessarily, right? So if you're working outside of school, so it can be a great option, if you to help pay for college, but also to keep things manageable so you can focus on your studies. And the amount of those awards typically range from about $2,500 to about $6,000, depending on the school, and a lot of that's just what they're allocated and the cost of school itself. Lastly, in this section, we'll be looking at loans, and this is borrowed money that must be paid back with interest. So these, this is the least desirable of the four listed here, but also common for students. There are federal student loans and parent loans available, so you really want to focus on federal student loans. I wouldn't bother with private loans. If you're looking at private loans outside of the federal loans, you should really evaluate if that college is the best option because there's a lot of risk with that. But for federal student loans, those are managed much better. Use student loans first versus parent loans because there's a better interest rate. So that's one tip I have for parents who often think that they need to take out the parent loan instead of their student. I would suggest having them pay for your loan as a student, but use the student loan first. One thing to address too, going back to kind of some of the media hype and sensationalism is while student loan debt is a very real concern for students and families throughout the country, most of the horror stories you hear about loans relate to graduate school or private loans. students are actually limited in what they can borrow from the federal government. So you couldn't, as a student, borrow the cost of attendance if you wanted to. That first year, you're really restricted to about $5,500. So, the average debt in Washington State is about $25,000 per student. That's actually less at University of Washington, but that's just a general figure looking at all the different types of schools throughout the state. And lastly, we want to have some takeaways for you, right? This is a big topic. There's definitely more research you'll need to do in the process, but we want you to have something tangible to take home. And I think the first of which, and I think Mary Beth described this really well, is you'll need to have a family discussion about what the family is able to pay and also willing to pay, because that's very important. And it's really heartbreaking for students when they have their heart set on a school and their family in the springtime says, well, it's not going to work for us. And it would have been great to know that money on the front end. And, oftentimes families can be apprehensive about sharing financial information with one another. But this is a really important decision. It's a large financial expenditure for many families, not all, but it's worth a conversation early on, just so everyone goes in on the same page and with clear mind. So that's really something to keep in mind. Have that discussion early. Students, ask that if you're comfortable. Parents own that and really try to take that conversation up with your student as best as possible. Also, I mentioned it many times, but the net price calculator is your best friend in this process. So really use that net price calculator to get those estimates of what a school might cost. As Mary Beth and Kelly said, talk to counselors. They're the experts. They can point you to resources. They can point you to scholarship opportunities. So really work on connecting with them. Go to your college and career center, go to your counselor, really take advantage of that time in those meetings. That can pay dividends. One thing that I didn't touch on too much, but I think was interwoven in some of the pieces about the net price calculator, was having a balanced college list. So really having different options, not just focusing maybe on one type of school. Look at different types of schools. What schools offer great financial aid packages? Affordability is also a concern. Not only, can you get in, but can you afford it? That should also factor into your search if financial aid is a concern. So really thinking about balance in that list. Don't put all your eggs in one type of basket. And that, while that applies to selectivity, it's also going to apply to money. So really use that to help explore different options. And as Mary Beth said, keep an open mind. And lastly, talk to the financial aid office at the different colleges you're looking at. I think that can be an underused strategy. And they can actually help with a lot of the questions that you have on specific FAFSA items, CSS profile items. You can understand how they award, when they award financial aid packages. They can give you a lot of good information. So feel free to reach out to the financial aid office and connect with them. If there's concerns about a particular situation, they're a great resource to talk to. So with that, I think I'll pass that off to Kelsey.
Great. Thank you, Derek. And I know we covered quite a bit of information today. So I know all of our panelists, Mary Beth, Kelly, and Derek, have talked about a number of resources. These are a couple of those places where you can find a lot of really great information. Fair Test talks a lot about the different test score policies at various institutions. I know Kelly touched on those test scores really briefly, but we do recommend also reaching out to various schools to learn a little bit more about what their test score policy is. There's a lot of, again, really great resources here in terms of college search engines like Big Future. Another great way to find schools is through looking college niche. So there's a lot of really great resources here that, again, if you're beginning this application and college search process, there's a lot of really great places to start here. Specifically, I just want to touch on the Coalition for College. That is the application site that the University of Washington uses. So if you're planning on applying here, which I hope you do, definitely be sure to check out the Coalition for College. As I believe Kelly mentioned earlier, a lot of schools are taking advantage of virtual opportunities. A great resource is through UVisit, a lot of online tours available to students, and of course going to various colleges' websites and looking at what type of virtual opportunities they're offering. And then of course we also have, we've touched a little bit on majors as part of that college search process. If you're curious as to what majors the University of Washington offers, we have linked our website there. We will also be doing some further Washington Wednesday series to talk a little bit more about our admissions to majors. So again, definitely check these out. I know we got a few questions in the chat, so I just wanted to address a couple of those. It looks like we had received a question regarding our policy or college's policies on P or pass grades. For the University of Washington, if your school moved to a pass, no pass, credit, no credit, due to COVID-19 and maybe moving to remote or online learning, know that that will not negatively impact your admissions application or review process. We take a multitude of factors into consideration when we are reviewing the application. And so we do have ways to compensate if there isn't necessarily a letter grade available. We would also encourage you to let us know maybe somewhere in your application that there was a grading scale change during one of your years at high school. If your school does have the option of having a letter grade, we would recommend doing that. That way we just have a little bit more context about how you performed in that class, because many schools will vary in terms of what they consider a P or a pass grade. So again, depending on the institutions that you're looking at, please be sure to reach out to the schools that you're interested in to make sure that you're providing the information that is needed, and also to check with them about their various policies. I'm going to throw it back to Aubrey to see if there were any other questions that came in today that she wanted us to answer.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey. And a huge thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your wealth of knowledge with our students. I think this is such an important time for our students, and really helping them start out on the right foot is so important for the success throughout their senior year. So thank you again for lending your expertise and sharing tips and tricks to help make the college search process easier. We do have a few questions that have been entered tonight, so students, feel free to continue to ask your questions. We'll get to as many of those as possible, but we'll go ahead and start opening up those questions to our panelists. So we'll start by Mary Beth, since you talked on the college list, I'll direct this first question to you. What would you say is the maximum amount of schools to have on a list?
Sure. Thanks, Aubrey. I think that is a great question, but it doesn't have a great answer. Because I would assume that the panelists will probably agree with me too, that there isn't a magic number, right? There's not that you have to apply to this many, or you can't apply to any more than this number. I always tell students, apply to the amount of schools that feels right for you, meaning that you feel like you have a list that checks all the boxes, right? That you have schools that you're well qualified for, that you feel confident you can get into, that you have schools that might feel like a little bit of a reach, but that you want to go for it anyways, that you have schools that check that financial box like Derek was talking about, schools that have the majors you want. So there's not necessarily like this magic number, but I do think that students can get carried away and apply to more than they need to. So with that, I would say to take a careful eye to your list and don't overwork yourself, because applications do take a lot of work too. So yeah, sorry, there's not a set answer on that, but I guess just do your best to come up with a list that you feel good about.
Thanks, Mary Beth. And I think that is a perfect answer, because there really is no right answer on the number of schools, because that's such a personal decision like you were talking about earlier. So thanks for sharing some more insight into what may be a good thought process on building that list. Our next question, I'm going to ask Kelly. Kelly, can you talk more about the 3 Ps, please? How would you assess programs, place, and people in a virtual or in-person tour?
Fabulous. Great question, and thank you for asking it. So in terms of programs, what you're looking for are things like internships, study abroad, undergraduate research, what the advising program looks like. And that should be a question you should ask anytime that you engage with a college. And one great study when you've got time later on this summer that you might want to look at is the Purdue Gallup Index. And they did a study on how life in college matters more than where you go to college. I'll say that again. Life in college matters more than where you go to college. And what their research found was it didn't matter where a student went to college, but if they had a project that lasted over 2 semesters, if they had a teacher that really believed in them, and they were involved in an extracurricular activity, regardless of where they went to college, they had the same outcomes later in life. And so when you're assessing the programs and the place and the people, think about those factors that I just mentioned. So I talked a little bit about programs. Let me move on to the place. And so the place is really about kind of the activities. And do you see yourself fitting with the mission of the school? And one of the best resources I think out there is directly on a college's website that it's about its mission statement, right? Go to its mission statement and says, okay, what does this college say that it's going to do? And that will help you get a really good sense for the place. And I think be honest with yourself about kind of what type of student you are. And every year, those of us who work on this side of the desk, we get to the end of the process and a student says, well, I applied to colleges as the ideal me. Like I wanted to be an extrovert, I wanted to go to a big city, but now I realize I'm more of a mid-sized city or a rural type of student. So think about really kind of who you are, who you hope to become, and be honest, right? That self-reflection that Mary Beth was talking about. Push yourself, right? You want to bend, but you don't want to bend so much that you break when you go to college. But the place is really about the mission of the school and what surrounds it and what activities are offered, right? Do students go home on the weekends? Do they stay there? Is there a strong sense of community? And in terms of the people, it's about how the alumni feel about the school. Are they continuing to be engaged? And there are many ways that you can chat and connect with alumni, even if you don't know one. You can reach out to the admissions office and they'll put you in touch. The people is about the professors that are there, the people who work there. Why do they work there? What's kept them there? How long have they worked there? So I hope that provides you with a little bit of a clearer answer on the programs, the place, and the people, and how to assess it. So thanks for asking for clarification.
Great. And thank you, Kelly, for providing those in-depth examples of how students can continue to explore the 3 Ps virtually or in person as well. Our next question is for Derek. Derek, does the net price calculator only include tuition, or does it include all costs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Aubrey. And it does include all costs. So they're trying to give you the best sense of what it'll cost to go to the institution. So they'll focus on that cost of attendance, not just tuition. Only things that could alter that is if they do have a function for living off campus. I think that cost would look a little more like the tuition, but colleges, even if you live at home with parents, they still budget in things like room and boards. They know your parents will have to buy you groceries, right? Make some Costco trips, those kinds of things. So they know there's still a cost to you being there. It's just not one that maybe is top of mind because they've been doing it for 18 years, but it's still a cost. And so they do factor those things into, even if you are living at home with parents. So it would be looking at that cost of attendance fully.
Great. And Derek, one more question about the net price calculator. Does the net price calculator take family assets into account or just income?
Oh, yeah, good question. It'll take into family assets. It won't go as deep, obviously, as the FAFSA and CSS profile in particular, but they will. The big one there is they'll ask home ownership on most calculators, and that's a big driver for schools that use the CSS profile. For a school like UW, they wouldn't look at that, but they will look at, the amount that you as a student have in savings or that your parents have in savings or any money received from outside, like a relative, that kind of thing. So they do take into they do take in those assets as well. But they're not looking at for the FAFSA. A school with looks only the FAFSA. They're not taking in like properties you own or something like that. So mainly that income and household size can be the primary driver, but they do look at some of the savings and other pieces too.
Great. Thank you, Derek. It's always important to know what is considered and how students can accurately provide that information. Our next question is going to Kelsey. Kelsey, this is a two-part question. So question starts, what is the probability of scholarship awarding for out-of-state applicants? And then the follow-up is, I've only seen around 2 to 3 opportunities for out-of-state students on the UW website, and most of them were automatically applied. So can you give us an overview of the out-of-state scholarship opportunities at the UW?
Yes, absolutely. And this is a really great question because, as Derek mentioned, that cost and affordability can be a huge consideration in that college search process. So for freshman applicants applying to the University of Washington, specifically the Seattle campus, we have one scholarship that we automatically consider applicants for. Specifically for U.S. non-residents of Washington. This is our Purple and Gold Scholarship, and students, again, are automatically considered when they submit their UW application. So there's no additional application they need to submit. Once they submit, they'll just be considered for this scholarship. It is based on our holistic review, so looking at both academics as well as some of those more personal factors. Historically, the Purple and Gold Scholarship has been awarded to over 50% of our admitted U.S. non-Washington residents, and amounts have ranged anywhere from $1,500 to $8,400 per year, renewable up to 4 years, as long as students remain in good academic standing. There may be other scholarship opportunities available to incoming freshmen. However, the Purple and Gold is the only one that's available through our Office of Admissions. So again, depending on what you're interested in, what you're looking to study, maybe what you want to participate in, there could be other scholarship opportunities available to you at the UW, but it would take a little bit of time to maybe research and apply to those. I really encourage students, if you have time now, look at outside scholarships. That's always a great way to help maybe bring some of those costs down when you attend school. So now this summer might be a really great time to start looking at some of those scholarship opportunities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for sharing more about the scholarship opportunities available for out-of-state students at the UW. This brings us to the end of our panel this evening. It's amazing how quickly time flies when you're covering important topics like the college search. So one more time, I just want to thank our panelists for joining us tonight and lending us your knowledge and sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it. And I also want to encourage our students joining us tonight to continue joining us through the rest of the summer. As Kelsey mentioned previously, we do have a really good lineup of events scheduled throughout the rest of the summer, covering a wide variety of topics. Next week, we are also covering writing your UW essays. So I know that's a really important topic to a lot of students, and you probably have questions about the UW writing section. I actually saw a question in the Q&A tonight that we addressed. So feel free to join us next week for that session and throughout the rest of the summer for the rest of our presentations. Also, please feel free to reach out to your admissions counselor at the UW if you have any specific questions. You can find our contact information on our website, which is this slide right here, so admit.uw.edu. You can search for your high school if you are from the state of Washington, or from your state if you are a U.S. non-resident. And if you are an international student, we also have an international admissions counselor here to help you. So please let us know if you have any questions. As Kelsey said, we are always here to help, and we do love talking to students. That's why we are in this profession. We're here to help you. So let us know if you have any questions. But thank you for joining us this evening, and we will see you later this summer for another Washington Wednesday. Have a good evening.